Welcome to Coffee and the Word. My name's Paul, and today I'd like to kind of push back on something I saw on Twitter recently regarding Justin Peters. And Justin Peters, who is a dear brother in Christ, is very active on Twitter, I've noticed, and sorry, I should be calling it X, really, shouldn't I? But he's kind of dragged me back into making videos. I've been absent for a while on this channel, not making videos due to, I guess, being unwell, life circumstances, being busy with various things. But I saw this on Twitter recently and I thought I've got to respond. And what I'm responding to is essentially, originally Mike Winger put out a post on X, and his post was regarding the book God's Generals by Robert Sladen. Now I want to preface it with this: I do not endorse the book God's Generals by Robert Sladen. I have some problems with it as somebody who's done a history degree, and specifically the person I'm going to talk about in this video, Evan Roberts. I did my history dissertation on Evan Roberts. So I have issues with the historiography used by Robert Sladen in the book, as well as some other issues that came up when I read it probably about 20 years ago now. And as a younger person, even then, there were some things that concerned me, such as, I believe at one point he says it's okay for a woman to divorce her husband to pursue the call of God on her life. Now, correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, if I misread that or misremembering that, but I'm pretty sure that's something he put in there. And there was a few other things in there I had issue with as well. But I don't want to talk about the book as a whole. I want to talk about what came out of Twitter as Mike Wing has been looking at this book. He's looking at this book, as far as I understand, because he's doing an investigation into prophetic ministry in places like Bethel, IHOP, and it's led him down a rabbit hole to a guy called William Branner, who is talked about in the book. So this is what Mike Winger put on X. It says, "Is there anyone legit among those listed as God's generals in the book God's Generals? I'm having some doubts that even a single one is legit. Sorry for those who have no clue what I'm talking about. This is one tiny piece of a massive amount of research into whatever's been happening among major charismatic leaders over the last couple of generations. Many modern charismatic, I'd say hyped charismatics, I'm guessing means hyper charismatics, but hyped is good too, I guess. Leaders have pointed to the people in the books God's Generals as a group of anointed individuals that have a pattern that they may pattern themselves after, but they seem like they might be a bunch of frauds. Here's a list, exalted by Bethel and others as a model for future ministries." So they got John Alexander Dowie, Mariah Woodworth Etter, Evan Roberts, Charles Parnham, William Seymour, John G. Lake, Smith Wigglesworth, Amy Semple McPherson, Catherine Coleman, William Brannan, Jack Cole, and A.A. Allen. Now, as far as I understand it, the pushback mainly has been around Evan Roberts in the comments from Mike Winger, and then only in Evan Roberts when it comes to Justin Peters. So this is Justin Peters' response. I wish I could do it in his kind of deep southern drawl. He has a very rich voice. He's there, "No, not a one, dear ones," but he doesn't write dear ones. He says, "I say that with no cessationist bias at all. Not a single one." You know, so that's my Justin Peters impression, as good as it gets. And I'm sure I'd love to hear him do an impression of a Welshman. I'm sure that'd be fun as well. But he's emphasized there, no, not a single one. Now, I understand he might have done a video on some of the guys on this at some point and talked about them, but a lot of the pushback has been around Evan Roberts in the comments on X, and I'd like to push back online because, one, I've done my history dissertation on Evan Roberts, and two, I think if you go looking for flaws with Evan Roberts, you'll find them. But I think the perspective that we've got to hold some of these historical figures in is in the perspective of frauds and frauds. Now, frauds are those that have issues in their life, issues in their ministry, but when you look back, you would say these are followers of Jesus as best as you can determine. And actually, there was a lot in their ministry that really impacted people for the sake of Christ, for the gospel. And I think the Bible shows us this. You go through the Old Testament, it's quite clear. You very rarely find somebody with some kind of flaw in them in the Old Testament. Some had great flaws, but yet God used them powerfully. Their work still stands. They wrote scripture and other things. And even in the New Testament, you look at somebody called like Peter, for example, at one point had to be rebuked by the Apostle Paul. Now, it seems that he adjusted to that rebuke, but the reality is the Bible shows us there was a very human side to Peter. And so we see that there. We see these flaws. You look through church history, and Martin Luther, at least towards the end of his ministry, you could say there were some great flaws there, some great issues, and some of the things that he claimed to come from the Lord that he spoke out, the anti-Semitism that seemed to be in his thinking and in his ministry. Now, whether that was a mental breakdown, as one of his biographers, I think it's Eric McTaxis, says, or whether there was just kind of some things that came out and he had a weakness of character, we don't know. We can't judge historical figures sometimes from this distance, only to say we look back at some of the things that Luther taught, some of the things that he brought to Christianity, the Reformation as a whole, and we would say these are good things and there's a lot of good fruit there, and we honor and we thank God for the good fruit there. We look at John Wesley, again, great evangelist, impacted the UK, impacted colonial America, and he had a situation with his wife that would mean he wouldn't qualify for the eldership team at my church. But yet we wouldn't deny the great work that he did and the fruit of his ministry and the fruit that came forth from his life. We would look at these guys and say there was flaws there. And even I would say Spurgeon seemed to have some flaws in him. And Evan Roberts, again, is the same. But some things I would say to kind of defend Evan Roberts was he seemed to be fairly orthodox throughout his life and his ministry. He grew up a Calvinistic Methodist. Now, I'm not a Calvinist, so I probably disagree with him on some things there. But he grew up a Calvinistic Methodist. He had a love for the scriptures, a love for the Lord, passionate pursuit. He was known to consistently be reading the scriptures every chance he got, that he treasured his Bible. So he was a guy that certainly had a love for the scriptures, but also grew up in a climate where there was an understanding that God moved in significant ways on people to use them greatly for his purposes. And that in God's moving, God could speak prophetically through people and speak with unction and various ways. And we see this going back all the way to a guy called Howell Harris. Howell Harris was a friend of George Whitefield, and together they laid the roots of Calvinistic Methodism in Wales, and almost kind of this 150-year period where God seemed to be moving regularly with both local, regional and national revivals in Wales kind of almost stems from the ministry of those two. Seeing then somebody significant like David Morgan, who was one of the main revivalists during the 1859 revival. God used him powerfully. Again, would believe deeply in an experience of the Spirit, in the leading of the Spirit, in the speaking of the Spirit, things that maybe modern cessationists like Justin Peters and the G3 crowd would deny and don't believe would exist. And so Evan Roberts was definitely a man of both word and spirit when God used him during the revival. I would point to the fruit of the revival. Now, I would say this, when we look at the Welsh revival in 1904, Evan Roberts was certainly the most prominent figure, but there was a lot happening in Wales that Evan Roberts never even visited, touched, or was involved with. It was a national movement. He happened to be the prominent figure, but the fruit of the revival was massively, significant across the world. So I've heard people from Argentina, South Korea, India, they talk about how the Welsh revival impacted their nation. This could be a whole video in and of itself, and I don't have time to go into it. But then you got parts of England, Europe as well that had been impacted by the 1904 Welsh revival. And there was correspondence between Evan Roberts and a guy called William Seymour from Azusa Street. Regardless of what you think of Azusa Street and everything that came out of there, some might have positive or negative views depending on their theological position watching this video. But I'm sure that the writings and what was going on in Wales stirred a hunger for the Lord and for a move of God in those guys in Azusa Street, which led to the birth of Pentecostalism, at least in a formal sense, in the United States. But then in the UK, there was great fruit in the sense of 3 major denominations coming out of the Welsh Revival: Elim denomination, Apostolic Church, and also the Assemblies of God UK was a group of Pentecostal churches impacted by the Welsh Revival that developed over that time and then formed to come together to be the Assemblies of God Great Britain. Now, I will say this. There might be a different view on Pentecostalism in a sense of what was reported in the Welsh Revival. So one of the endorsers of the Welsh Revival, and this is something I put out on X in my response to Justin Peters, is I'd rather take the views of G. Campbell Morgan and Martin Lloyd-Jones over Justin Peters on this matter. Now, G. Campbell Morgan was a pastor of a church called Westminster Chapel. He was Martin Lloyd-Jones' predecessor, and actually Martin Lloyd-Jones' pastor for a time when Lloyd-Jones was assistant pastor there at Westminster Chapel. And he went to visit the revival, and you can read this in Eyewitness Testimonies. It's a book put together by W.T. Stead. And G. Campbell Morgan writes in that book that Evan Roberts is a man that God has raised up. So he looked at this man. This is a guy who's known as the Prince of Expositors, friends with Charles Spurgeon. He knew D.L. Moody, was impacted by D.L. Moody's ministry, was a highly respected preacher, well known, to the point that when he came to Wales, people were like, hey, do you want to come preach? And he was like, no, I'm not going to preach. And so he never went back to the Welsh Revival because he didn't want to be drawn in to becoming a central figure there. He was like, no, this is God's thing. God is using other people. I don't want to touch it and interfere with it, lest, I cause it some harm. But he recognized, and he was friends with Evan Roberts, that God had raised him up. As this is a prince of expositors, a guy, if you read the list of the books he's written, it's a phenomenally large list of books. And this was a guy who was well versed in the scriptures. And again, Martin Lloyd-Jones looks back at the Welsh Revival, the fruit there, Evan Roberts, and was impacted and moved by it, though. Martin Lloyd-Jones would be too young to have known the Welsh Revival. In a sense, he would just be a young boy when it happened. But at the same time, he would have known people personally that would have been impacted. Now, I'm not sure if he knew Evan Roberts personally, but I do know that the life and the ministry impacted him. And so we've got these two endorsements of Evan Roberts. No indication, even from some of his critics, that he was a fraud or a false teacher. But I will say this. There are some things about Evan Roberts that the people can maybe question. And one of those is, his young age. He was 26 when the revival happened. So this guy that just with a passion for the Lord went to his youth groups like, God's going to move. God showed up, caused a national revival, and suddenly he's carrying a bit of the burden and the weight of this thing. No experience in ministry, very little formal training. He had about maybe half a term of theological training in him when he went back to his home church in Lucca when God moved. And so he's a guy that's young, he's inexperienced, he's going to make mistakes. What 26-year-old in any ministry, if you're just a pastor in a small church and you're 26 years old, even with theological training, you're going to have flaws, you're going to make mistakes. Let alone somebody with a national spotlight upon him. The major newspaper of Wales, the Western Mail, was constantly writing reports of the Welsh Revival and stories about Evan Roberts. And so he had the national spotlight on him. He wasn't a preacher. So G. Campbell Morgan writes about this. He kind of writes in his in that book, Eyewitness Accounts, that Evan Roberts gives an address, and then he follows up with, it was barely an address. So he recognized something, that Evan Roberts wasn't necessarily a preacher or a teacher. I'm not sure Evan Roberts really saw that as his role. But then G. Campbell Morgan notes that this, and he writes this is a continuation of Pentecost. And he actually leans into the Joel 2 and Acts chapter 2, where he says, this is that, as Peter says. And so he's like, when you're talking about the Welsh Revival, this is that. So despite the lack of preaching and teaching, which is one of the criticisms labelled at the Welsh Revival, especially in light of previous Welsh revivals and things like the Great Awakening as well. And so that was labelled at him. but it doesn't mean preaching and teaching wasn't going on in other services, and it didn't mean that the gospel wasn't going forth. And also, Evan Roberts did emphasize conversion. He emphasized the lordship of Christ. He emphasized repentance from sin and holiness. And so these were key markers of what Evan Roberts did bring in his ministry to people. And so that was definitely there in his ministry, but you could criticize him for not being a preacher teacher. You could criticize him for the way that he handled his personal life in terms of just burnout. He didn't sleep a lot, just believed God would sustain him. And of course, you know, there is a theology of rest. And we look back in 2025, and I would say we know more about it now. How much of us practice that theology of rest well? Probably a lot less practice it than know it. But he obviously got caught up in what God was doing and didn't rest well. And I would say part of that, especially when you read An Instrument of Revival, where he talks about some of the things Evan Roberts did in public and how harsh he could be towards people or situations, at times probably a result of tiredness. And I would say, was that a flaw? Yes. Does it invalidate his ministry or put him in the fraud category? I would say no. And then finally, there's question marks over the latter part of his life, where he lived with a lady called Jessie Penn Lewis and her husband. And now this is where I think God's Generals took a bit of liberty, in my opinion, where Robert Slidden labeled Jessie Penn Lewis as Jezebel. I've read no other materials that would say that about her. Some cast questions on why she took Evan Roberts in. Others say she actually saved his life, potentially in that time and season of burnout. There is a bit of division in the literature over the impact that she had and how much he was involved in her ministry and her writings. There's some debate around that as well. He didn't live with her and her husband indefinitely. And I will say this, we don't know what ministry God called Evan Roberts to have after the Welsh revival, whether it was stopped short or whether 1904, 1905 was that. We don't know. Only God knows. So I think we've got to be fair to him there. But what we do know is he had a great ministry of prayer. And he spent most of his life praying for Wales, praying for the nations. And that's a significant ministry in and of itself. And my prayer is that the prayers that he's prayed and others have prayed, the likes of Rhys Howells, have prayed, and other people, just ordinary Christians up and down this nation, that those prayers would be heard in my generation and God would move again. But anyway, I wanted to make this video just to make a relatively short defense of Evan Roberts. Maybe I'll make a longer video at some point going through his life and ministry, and I think probably there's scope for a video to be made about the fruit of the Welsh revival and why sometimes people think there wasn't a lot of fruit. But anyway, hopefully this is a good pushback on Justin Peters and something for him to consider, and Mike Winger, as he's doing his research, for him to consider as they're looking at the roots of the charismatic movement. And I would finally add this, that, and again, this could be a video in of itself, I think a lot of the modern charismatic church, at least in the UK, perhaps in Europe, has been majorly influenced by the 1904-05 Welsh revival. I would say sang worship has been influenced greatly by the revival, alongside some of the experiential side of Pentecostal charismatic ministry, more so than we realise. But I do understand that a charismatic church, and I would plead with Justin Peters and Mike Winger, when they do their research, that they understand that there are many threads that lead to the modern charismatic church, some of which I believe are good and healthy and positive, some of which I believe are actually unhealthy and have brought some unnecessary baggage into the movement, and unpicking them sometimes can be complicated, and sometimes people lean towards one particular strand to caricature then the whole movement, and I would caution people against that. But anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there. I'll be looking to make some more videos soon. My hope is to respond to some of the G3 cessationist conference and bring some people into that. I'd like to bring a friend on here to discuss the 1859 Welsh revival as well, and also maybe look at this question: why is the charismatic movement, why is there so much kind of frauds and charlatans in our movement, and what do we do about that, and what might be the answer? I think that'd be a good video to make. Anyway, make sure you like the video, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one. God bless.